Good evening. It's actually very nice. It's the first time we're doing an event, and it's still really bright outside. How rejoicing. So good evening and welcome to the Columbia Global Centers Paris. We are Columbia University's academic center in France. With a presence here, we have historians in the room, so I have to get my facts right, since 1964. And as I like to say, one of our main focuses beyond teaching and research is highlighting and promoting the rich artistic, cultural, and intellectual ties that connect France and the United States. This month, as you will notice, our programming was dedicated to celebrating the many contributions of women to society. And in that context, I'm very happy to introduce Michelle Young, who will be talking to us about an absolutely remarkable female figure who was a wartime spy and resistant Rose Valland. And as we were discussing in the preliminary chat, she's like a hero of many films. Voilà. Before I turn the floor, allow me to introduce our two speakers. Michelle, who is a graduate of Harper Collins in the history of art and architecture, and holds a master's degree in urban planning from Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where she is now a professor. She is also the founder of an online publication that I highly recommend to anyone who wants to experience New York differently for its hidden gems. The publication is called Untapped New York, so you should reach out to Michelle after the talk. And Michelle is also the author of numerous books, including Broadway, a book on Secret Brooklyn, an unusual guide, and New York, hidden bars and restaurants. Voilà, lots to talk about. Voilà. But her current project is on Rose Valland, and we are particularly privileged tonight to receive a sneak peek into this work, which will be published by HarperOne, Harper Collins. Michelle will be in conversation this evening with another distinguished alumna from Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, otherwise known as GSAPP. I think I may refer to it that way going forward. It's a very long name. Ariela Katz, who is an associate professor at the École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture Paris-Malaquais, where she teaches both architectural history and design. Her research and teaching focus on ideology and aesthetics in interwar European architecture, modernisms beyond Europe, and critical reevaluations of recent theory and practice. Professor Katz is also currently teaching in Columbia's New York-Paris architecture program, which she co-directed from 2003 to 2007. I'm most delighted to have the two of you in conversation this evening, and I thank the Columbia Alumni Association France, in the presence of Jean-Pierre Reichenbach, its president, and the Alumni Association of GSAPP for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. Very happy to be here.
Séverine neglected to mention that we have a slight problem since I'm an graduate of Yale, and you are one of Harvard. So
here.
Let's just put that aside for this evening. I don't know if you want to speak briefly about how you came to this project. We just had a little planning snafu that has been resolved. So perhaps we should start with that. Just how did you come to Rose Valland and to this book? Also, we'll talk about writing later.
Absolutely. So in my day job previously, I wrote about New York, taught about New York City, about architecture and design. And so in my spare time, I would read only World War II books. And then when I married someone French, I decided to do World War II French books. And then from there, I ended up in a subgenre that I guess most people don't know, but World War II female spy books. And there's a whole genre of that. So I had been pretty well read in those books, and I took a little detour and read a book called Goring's Man in Paris, and it is by a man named Jonathan Petropoulos, who is a professor in California. And Rose Valland appeared in some chapters of this book because that art dealer of Goring's worked in the Jeu de Paume as part of the ERR, which is the team that looted Jewish art during World War II. And so every time she showed up on the page, it just like I felt like she sparkled. And even the little that was given sounded fascinating. And then I was like, how did I not know about her with my obsession? So I looked up briefly what had been written about her. And there were definitely some books in France, but very little in the English language, and nothing written in the what we call narrative nonfiction style. So these are books that are totally based in fact, but read like a novel, like a film or something. And so I decided to pursue that. But it took some time. I was pregnant, I gave birth, and then during my maternity leave at night, between feedings, I would like test out if I could write some chapters. So that's how it came to life, and and it went from there.
Shall I ask you to give a brief background? I know you
Yeah,
didn't
absolutely.
want to do a full presentation.
Yeah, I didn't want
but
to lecture you
perhaps
all. I think it's
a
more
brief
interesting to have
background about
yes,
to
absolutely.
situate Rose Valland.
Yeah, so Rose Valland, born at the end of the 19th century in Saint-Étienne-de-Saint-Joire. This town is 40 minutes southeast of Lyon. Obviously not a place known to Parisians. She excels in school, and her mother, although her mother was at home and taking care of the family, really supported her educational career, and so kept pushing her to and applied for many scholarships so that she could go to boarding school. And then then next she went to École des Beaux-Arts in Lyon, and then the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And all along the way, she struggled with misogyny, with class comments about her class, and so she really fought her way through the education system. And she came in 6th in her class at the École des Beaux-Arts Paris, which was really incredible, given that they had cut the course for women because women were not allowed to join the men's drawing course. And they had said, oh, sorry, when she got there, no more space, and we won't open a new one. So despite that, she finished 6th, and then she went to the École du Louvre after this, wrote a thesis, and then she also studied at the Sorbonne, and several other École des Hautes Études here in Paris.
The École des Hautes Études or École pratique des Hautes Études?
École des Pratiques, I think.
des
Well, anyway,
Hautes
she was
Études.
literally everywhere, and together that got her a special licence in art history.
What
Yeah.
did she study, just out of curiosity, at the École des Beaux-Arts?
She was
doing
painting and
or
drawing.
painting?
Yeah, she was extremely
Interesting.
talented. And you can in some books you can still see some of her drawings and
she
watercolors
finished?
and such. She finished
and
all
then
of them.
went to
Yeah.
curatorial studies.
So she basically, if we
Yeah.
do equivalent in American degrees, she would have probably had 3. She would have her undergraduate and
Yeah.
then kind of like 2 masters.
Yeah. It's interesting at that point to start to pass from art practice to
Yes, and
really
actually I
the
think that was a deliberate
curatorial
move
training.
because at the École du Louvre, the director, his name was Henri Verne, and he was also the head of the Musées Nationaux. He really did not like her, and you can see from his letters they are harsh words. And so the other problem was that her very close mentor was Henri Faucillon, and the two of them, Verne and Faucillon, had a rivalry. I don't think Faucillon really cared about Verne, but for Verne, Faucillon was like the art history mind of the time, and very modern in his thinking. And so him and Rose were very close, and so her writings and the way she thought about art was quite modern as well. And so he gave her a very bad grade on her thesis, and I think as a result, so I don't have exact proof, but I believe that she went to the École du Louvre so that she could switch tacks. So instead of becoming an artist now,
Curatorship,
start curating,
yeah.
and then after the École du Louvre, she probably thought, I didn't get such a good grade here. So let me have Faucillon, and there's also a man named Gabriel Millet she was close with. Let me have them take me along with what they're doing. So
Where Faucillon was an academic, really, more
yes,
than a...
yeah, and I think at the root she was too.
Yeah. Maybe start with a big question. We had
Yeah.
spoken about a couple of different themes, and you've already touched on it. Obviously, today is organized in part because of the date corresponds to this issue, but how relevant was it, beyond the experience at the École du Louvre, how relevant was the fact that she was a woman to her career, either negatively speaking or perhaps positively speaking, in terms of a kind of useful invisibility?
Yeah, so there were almost no women working in the art curator field. There started to be a few, but really there was one woman before her, and she was married to the sculptor Georges Sopic, so she had a way in. Not to discredit that woman's own abilities, she became a very famous teacher at the École du Louvre eventually. But Rose really came from quote-unquote nowhere, and she was not feminine in the way that I think other women were at the time. So, and then I also believe that she had a kind of brusque manner. So either you loved her or you felt this distance from her. So she definitely had a difficult time kind of rising her way through her career. And actually, so after she finishes at school at the École du Louvre, she starts applying for jobs. And this is the beginning of where you see the letters and the words of Henri Verne, who keeps denying her any position there. And so it's a little bit unknown how she ends up in the Jeu de Paume, like whether she knew André Desarrois, the curator there beforehand, or because she also worked on his magazine. So did she know him from the magazine, or did she get hired from the magazine after she met him? Unclear. But he agrees to hire her as not as a curator, but as a secretary. So you either entered the museums always as attaché bénévole, an unpaid, but either as a curator or a secrétaire bénévole.
Always bénévole.
Always bénévole. I think at this time there was
Really?
I don't think there was any way.
Other than the concours, which is how you would enter now.
Oh, okay. And you would have to spend 4 years as a bénévole until you could apply to become paid. And so as a result of what happened to her, since she could not get any other job because Henri Verne blocked everything, she took the secrétaire bénévole, but she had to spend 4 years there until she could even possibly move to the other side, which was unheard of, go to secretary to curator. She manages to do this. There are letters that she got from every one of her supporters, and those are all in her records at the National Archives. And at some point, she's allowed to do so. Now she has to spend another 4 years unpaid. So this takes her
as a voluntary,
exactly, but now as a curator. She's doing the same job because there's no one else who works at the Jeu de Paume except for her boss and her and the guardians. So there's no other curatorial person there. So she's, her job doesn't change. It's just that in 1936 she's finally given this title. So by the time the war breaks out, she's still unpaid. And her boss is often either traveling or sick or missing. So she ends up curating many exhibitions on her own, or mostly on her own.
And she's in her 40s by then, or late 30s?
Yeah, late 30s. Yeah. So I believe she's maybe 32 by the time she gets that first secrétaire bénévole job. Yeah.
And the Jeu de Paume, what was its specialization at that
so
time?
it's not like what it is today. It was specialized in international modern art. So they had exhibitions often based on country, art from Latvia, art from South America. They did a great exhibition on 3 centuries of American art, which included photography and film. Very forward-thinking, and collecting for their permanent collection from artists that are famous today, but were a bit overlooked. And so she became very knowledgeable in modern art, which then, as we'll talk about later, served her in World War II.
I guess the presence of the water lilies kind of... Oh, no,
that's in the Orangerie. But
Orangerie, although it's simultaneous and was introduced as a contemporary work at the time.
And often the Orangerie, the Jeu de Paume, and the Grand Palais would do, or Petit Palais, they would do exhibitions all together. So there was an exhibition on Italian art. The other thing the Jeu de Paume would try to do is serve as almost like a political mediator for the French government, not officially, but
like a mouthpiece.
It was thought that if we do exhibitions with some of these countries, it may help relations. And so there was one on Italian art in the late 30s, and then before the war broke out, they were actively working one on with Germany, which did not happen.
Interesting.
And so those kind of exhibitions, they would show, for example, several centuries of work in one museum and then several centuries in the other museum, and you would kind of go around. And Rose won several prizes for articles, art history articles she wrote in newspapers, France, in Paris, and in the south of France, for the Italian art exhibition.
So very involved in a kind of public face of the museum, even though she wasn't always recognized within the museum world.
Yeah, and one of the things I started tracking is, does her name ever appear in the exhibition catalogs, and when? And so at some point her name does appear, and then at some point her name starts to appear in newspaper reports about the openings. Every opening at the Jeu de Paume was like big news in the newspaper world, because everybody was showing up, from like politicians to artists to Picasso would show up, and so it was a big deal. And then you start to notice at some point, they mention Rose Valland, suddenly. And so she was starting to become somewhat, at least a public figure in some sense.
And just because I feel like we're holding off on the big surprise about what her role was in this wartime period, perhaps talk about that now that we've built up this context. And also maybe I might ask you to go back and explain why there was a linguistic connection. So there's there are a number of biographical details that kind of play into her story.
So I think we should start a little bit in 1938. This is the time of the Munich Accords. Right before the Accords are signed, it's pretty much assumed that war is going to happen. So Czechoslovakia mobilizes. France does a partial mobilization, which triggers the packing of the museums. And the museums have been planning since 1932 how to respond to a future war, because the response in World War I was way too late. They only started protecting the art and packing when Germans invaded the borders of France. And so it was a very hurried endeavor, and they said that the museums were like, that can never happen again. And so planning started happening for many years, and 1938 they had to evacuate for the first time. So she's there at the Jeu de Paume, and she packs up the art and sends it on the trucks. And then once the accord is signed, actually literally the moment they're notified, they bring it all back. So it returns to Paris. Not much happens between 1938, September to June. The summer after, right? And then they learn from some of their mistakes. In 1938, they improve the plan. Jacques Joujard, who becomes her boss, had, in the meantime, evacuated the Spanish collections from the Prado and all of those. So he had done that for Spain with a consortium of players. He learned from that, and then revised the plan for the French museums, and then, of course, it went into effect the end of August
of 39.
Of 39. Yeah.
So at the moment of the occupation, of the full-on.
Yeah, correct. So they packed the art, a lot of it overnight, but then they were shipping art to the Loire Valley for months, actually. Usually when the story is told, they just say that they did it in 2 days, and then everything went down there. But if you look at the trucking records, which I just went through, page by page, it was really going on for a long time. Because the Musée National was not only responsible for the Louvre, but they were responsible for things like the Comédie Française, like the theater groups, all the museums affiliated with them in Paris, but also in the provinces. So they had to move all of that. And the decision was made in the 1930s that they would handle from top down. They didn't want to let the provincial museum deal with the provincial government. They said we need to move it all together, which was, I think, a smart move for what happens in the war.
It's interesting if we connect it to our other respective fields in architecture and in planning, how that consciousness of preparing for war, how early it came into effect, and how early architects and planners were thinking about the war to come, and how much that plays into their imagination. So it's interesting to hear that it's really present in the museum world as well.
Yeah, they were sending out directives all the time. They were asking curators to prepare the lists of priority artwork should they need to start packing. And so I think when they did need to pack, then there was a system in place. And then they were constantly getting feedback on how to improve.
So Rose Valland already had a lot of experience from the planning stages.
Yeah.
About having to do with logistics.
Right.
And
That's correct.
in this vitally important collection with 2 curators and a bunch of truck drivers.
Yeah, truck drivers, guardians, guards, people who did the
Packers.
landscaping. Yeah, everyone pretty much pitched in. And actually, by the time this happens, Desarrois is gone again. So he's gone pretty much all of 1939. He's on leave for his heart problems. He then goes to the World's Fair in New York, and then the curators come back, and then he actually was a World War I flying ace, basically, and so he volunteers back into the Air Force. So he's gone around the beginning of August. And so she's then again on her own.
In charge.
So she was very familiar with the guardians, who seemed to really have a good relationship with her. And then about the background that you're mentioning, she is supposed to have been able to understand German. I don't know how well she spoke it. So she had that. And obviously her training as a secretary, she knew how to type, but also how to write shorthand. So that plays into how she was able to take notes later.
And that's right. We talked about the shorthand, which is
my
still
shorthand
one of your
quest.
projects.
I've closed out that project, but we'll talk about that.
Okay. I think I want to ask you to recount a little bit, without spoiling too much, the next chapter before I go into some broader questions that actually, I think, tie in to a really wide range of questions about history, about the war.
Yeah, okay, so we're in
About gender.
August, September 39. As we all know, not much happens again in the war between 39 and June 1940. They call it the funny war. In France, it's the drôle de guerre, right? Or phony for the British, the funny for the Americans, and then, so June 1940, the Germans enter the borders of France. They go towards Paris. So this is the last evacuation, and Rose is doesn't want to leave the museum. For her, the art needs to be protected. She already knows how to bomb-proof the museum, so she's working on this. And they tell her finally, you really need to leave. And this is they were taking Péniche to move the staff down the Seine, and they said this is the last Péniche. You need to get on it. And so she helps direct that, and I won't reveal some of the exciting things that will be in the book. But she makes it down to Loire Valley, to Valençay, where she hears the call of June 16th of de Gaulle on BBC. And she writes about that in her autobiography, how she felt, which is a rare thing that Rose does, is talk about how she felt. There's nearly nothing.
Right, because she published her memoirs in the 60s, and then they were recently
republished by the museums. But she was an academic at heart, and so she wanted to talk about how this came about, and she didn't want to put herself in it. Then, within 2 weeks of getting down to Loire Valley, she gets her Ausweis somehow. I'm sure Georgard got it for her. So he calls her back, and she says nothing much happens until that fall. So she's trying to figure out what to do with her time. In the meantime, the Germans, under Abetz, who is the ambassador, has started to loot the art. Because Hitler and all those people, they're sending out many different directives about property and things, and the directives keep changing. And so Abetz said, oh great, and this will be under my purview, and I'm just going to go steal the art. So it basically, all the stuff they stole filled the German embassy. They asked for more space in the Louvre. They fill the 3-4 rooms in the Louvre, and then they ask Jacques Georgard for more space.
So they were expropriating.
Yeah, they had a list. They already did many studies. They had a list of all the Jewish art dealers, and they went to them first and took everything. And so Jacques Georgard receives the request from Metternich, who actually turns out to be like the better of the Germans. He worked very much with Georgard to figure out how to truly protect the art, but then he's kicked out of the organization a few years later. So Georgard suggests, well, we have this museum just next to the Louvre. It fulfills your purposes because it's isolated and nobody will come in and out like at the Louvre. You can bring a truck up to it, so it's perfect. But of course, he already knew that Rose Valland was there. And so the ERR, which is, and also by this point, Abetz has lost his political battle, because Göring and ERR, which is run by Alfred Rosenberg, have tried to come into this game, and they've won. And so
Rosenberg was a curator.
No,
also,
he was
or
just.
Was he a gallerist?
Oh no, that's Paul.
No,
Paul,
no, I know.
Oh no, Alfred Rosenberg was just sort of the theoretician about Jews and stuff in Germany.
Solution.
Yeah, a bit. Yeah, he was very interested in studying
Okay, I thought he was also involved with art history in Germany.
Not really. And he's sort of a distant figure. Göring, who was not part of his organization, is like aligned with Rosenberg, who lets him take over this looting operation. And so the ER moves in like November 1st, 1940, and Rose is already there. And the museums have asked the Germans if they can create what they call a parallel inventory. So everything that comes in must be inventoried by both Germany and France for the purpose of paperwork. But this is a way that the museums can have a supposed role and justify why they need somebody in the museum. And so that's what she's assigned with, and he says, you must stay here at all costs, is his directive to her.
They realized that through the oversight, by insisting on oversight, they were keeping records that might be useful later.
Yeah, I think, might as well try to keep records to figure out what's going on and use it later. But by the time the first day that she's there, she understands that they will not let her do this inventory, which is why we do not have an official parallel inventory. She did it in secret. So she's there for the next 4 years under great risk. 5 years, 40 to 44. She was kicked out of the museum many times, interrogated, and of course, in her way of speaking, she doesn't give you the details, but she says it was very uncomfortable. So I don't know what. We don't know exactly what the physical and psychological conditions were, but I feel like for her to say it's uncomfortable means it was probably very uncomfortable. And I think, well, I won't speak to that, but, and in the end, she was suspected many times, and she had a sort of German ally whom she hated, but he every time said she should come back. And she ends up being his prosecutor in the war tribunal crime.
In the Nuremberg.
Not Nuremberg, but there's the ones that happened in Paris, the military trials. And so she comes back, but then she's also pretty much gets a death warrant placed on her should she ever cross into Germany.
So they knew, but they suspected, but they didn't know that she was essentially collecting however she could, right?
Yes.
I heard something about taking stencils that were being used to stencil some of the crates and taking them home and recording what was written on them.
She stole negatives, had them developed, and then brought them back in and put them back in the files. So a lot of risks, and I believe she was also a bit going out into the field to find out where people lived, because she kept track of their addresses.
So she essentially compiled a second inventory of what was being expropriated.
Correct. Yeah, she did, and including the crate numbers, the train numbers, and their destinations, that was the critical thing that the Allies wanted at the end of the war.
Right, which was, well, I don't want to spoil the whole book, so shall we leave that as a question mark? Obviously, she had a number of important roles after the war. Well, at the very end, during the period of liberation, in relation with the American troops.
Yep, American troops.
Which maybe you can talk about briefly.
Yeah, so this is kind of how people know her today, is that she was a character in the Monuments Men movie, played by Cate Blanchett. Of course, they made her straight, not a lesbian, and that they suggest that she gave up her intel because she fell in love with Matt Damon. And I have met the family of what is Matt Damon's character, and they would also like that record corrected.
Better.
Yeah. But it was in fact Jacques Jaujard and some of the other museum staff who encouraged the Allies to speak to her, because she was actually did not want to give her information up to the French military. She was afraid of bureaucracy, and she was afraid that if she gave the information, it would just go nowhere. So she actually kept it to herself. And so they told James Rorimer, you need to become friends with her.
Right, who was her closest collaborator on the American side.
Correct, and he was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum. He's responsible for creating the cloisters. So he's very well educated, very well read, and so they really got along. And so kind of after wining and dining, which that part is accurate, I think they spent a lot of time together, but they also went around Paris looking for art, looking for store warehouses. Then he finally, she said, you must go to Germany and you have to find this stuff.
Right,
and
so she gives him the
information.
location, which
correct.
allows them to
Yeah.
find the most of what Goering had essentially amassed.
It gives them their first clues. Obviously, things got moved around from their initial destination, but they knew where things had initially been sent.
I want to ask you to talk about her her heritage, or what her persona, the history of her persona, and questions about her legitimacy. But I'm wondering whether I'm also curious to hear more about how the art was used by the Germans, or what was the relevance of collecting this art. We talked about the art market.
Yes.
What was the context in Paris at the time? What happened? Because some of the gallerists that were the first to be expropriated were collectors and gallerists for contemporary artists, which was a subject for the Germans because that was not approved.
Right. So Hitler had his definitions of what he considered art. Everything else was trash, And so that was of the old masters and Germanic in nature. And so he didn't collect any of the modern stuff, and in fact, wanted it burned and stuff. Then, but what happens is because of it becomes valuable to have that modern art, and then this idea of an exchange develops. So I'll give you my Vermeer, and you give me 20 Picassos. And so this was happening constantly amongst the Nazis, and then these paintings were then going on to the French art market. So the French art market was vibrant, making a lot of deals and a lot of money during this time. And if you start to see the names of the galleries, it becomes interesting to see which way a gallery would have gone. And Paul Rosenberg, for example, from way before the war, said not a cent to the Third Reich, and he was very adamant, and he was very influential in the Paris scene at the time, so he convinced many people not to participate in some of these so-called degenerate art sales. But others, are willing to play the game to make money, and so, that is history.
Right, but then that means that connected to these thefts, let's say, the spoliation, is a secondary and a tertiary market that Rose's work is also involved ultimately with exposing.
Right. And so there were some pictures that flipped through at the beginning. There's a room in the Jeu de Paume that she nicknames Salle des Martyrs, the room of the martyrs, and it was where all the degenerate art was placed and then, of course, moved later. And then a lot of this art ended up internationally, so there was a whole movement to sell art in New York. And a lot of the museums in New York have this art still on their walls.
The work was taken from families eventually as well, like in other countries. So you say the first victims, let's say, of this theft or expropriation are the gallery owners, the dealers.
But it's, like the Rothschild family was one of the first targets. It was really like anyone that they knew to be a big collector. They would go and liquidate that property.
maybe we'll come back to Rose's role in recovering property in her later career. But I'd like to ask you a little bit about this persona, about how she's seen in history, whether she constructs her own, how she constructs her own persona, what she does to construct a different persona in the museum world from her background. So maybe
I think one of the
how
things
she constructs herself
there are
and how
very
she's seen.
few audio or videos of her. In fact, there may be no videos of her that we know of. I was told that by another journalist researcher today. And in truth, I agreed. I haven't seen anything. But if you hear her speak, there's a radio interview that has also mysteriously disappeared off the French government website. So this is sort of the story of Rose Valland. Things like disappear constantly. But my husband says that she sounds exactly like how his grandfather spoke. Of that civil service class. And my theory is that she probably developed that way of speaking to work in this world. She definitely struggled after the war. So she worked on restitution in Germany for 7-8 years. She had many opportunities to come back. She was very celebrated right after the war. She was awarded the Légion d'honneur, the Médaille de la Résistance, the US Medal of Freedom. Germany gave her an award. So they believe she might be the most medaled woman in all of World War II, which is shocking why she's not very well known today. But my theory is that she stayed so long in Germany, she missed some of these opportunities. There was an opportunity for her to work in the US, maybe from James Wormer, or I think from that crew. So by the time she comes back, it's the mid-50s, and nobody really wants to talk about World War II anymore. So they give her an office in the Louvre. She continues to work on restitution for the rest of her life. But she becomes this kind of artifact, I think, of another time. And I think she kept prodding and poking and asking questions. And I think some of those questions get a little too close to the powers that be.
Right, questions about provenance.
Who was involved?
Yes.
Some people rewrote their stories very conveniently. Some very famous people, and disparaged her in their books after she died. And so there's been a sort of movement that has tried to discredit her achievements and what she did, and suggests that she may have even been involved in some shady things, which is there's no evidence for that.
Some of her work in restitution had to do with the Soviet Union as well. There's another geography of this story.
Yeah. So when she goes to Germany, she has to figure out where some of the art is and how to repatriate it. And she knows that many things are in the Soviet sector, but you can only go to the Soviet sector like on these official tours. And so she pretends to be a journalist with. Maybe she made up her own credentials and then let her in and then asked very probing questions. And then she did repatriate some stuff back to France from the Soviet sector.
But the Soviets had a different view.
Yes, they couldn't believe in all-out war, which we know today. And so they believe that anything that came into their sector was now theirs, even if it belonged to some other country. So almost nothing has been repatriated since the early days of that repatriation. Everything is still in Moscow. It's either in Moscow or in a Swiss vault.
Oh, I thought, but this must be from different locations. The work that was at the Hermitage was frequently denied until it was finally shown in the 90s.
Right. That was during Glasnost, and there was discussion to try to return those things back, but then after Yeltsin, it was dead.
Yeah. Interesting. So, as a figure, she shifts from being very much recognized right at the end of the war to somebody who doesn't fit into the new kind of Trente Glorieuses moment of euphoria and plenty after the war.
Right.
And how is her legacy maintained, or what are the debates about her legacy? How is she considered a resistant, or is she considered somehow because she wasn't fighting?
Right. So Georges made sure that he wrote a statement that's in the National Archives, like spelling out what she did. And then with the Médaille de la Résistance, we consider her as a member of the resistance, even though she didn't report, well, she reported directly to someone in the resistance. But that question does come up, you know. And then there have been some questions whether she was like involved with the Soviets, but I feel like those are the things that are used to try to discredit her legacy. And I believe, looking through all of the documents she left behind, that she was very concerned about what her legacy would be. She kept track of everything. You know, if she wrote a letter, she kept the envelope that she got back, the envelope, you know. And then when her book went out of print, she bought all those books and she gave them to libraries all around France. You know, that to me is like thinking about what your legacy is going to be. So I think what occurred with her legacy is not what she had wanted. Then in the late 90s, you know, a Rose Valland Association is created from Saint-Étienne de Saint-Joire.
In her hometown.
In her hometown. And then there are many exhibitions that start to be developed about her, and then we start to hear about her more in books. So she has a postage stamp in France that came out about 10 years ago, maybe. And so there's become more awareness, and I think, more interest in her as a woman as well.
I'd be interested to have you speak a little bit about the act of the research involved, or what kinds of materials you have worked with. Where do you go? Who do you speak to? And then maybe afterwards speak about this idea of the narrative nonfiction.
Yeah, how that differs. Yeah, sure.
Perhaps at the end we'll raise some questions of biography and their relevance to these figures.
So the sources are a lot of archives. So the Archives Nationales here in France, in Pierrefitte-sur-Seine, has all of the museum archives of the Musées Nationaux. And then La Courneuve has an archive for the diplomatic corps. And so her papers ended up there. I think 1,000 boxes from her office.
Her own, not her personal papers.
It was whatever's in her office, so it includes
administrative papers,
but it also includes some things like letters. It's a bit all over the place.
Yeah.
Me and my assistant opened up a lot of boxes because they're not inventoried.
You need a postdoc.
So you just know that this says personal files, so you got to go through every single document. And then in the U.S., because I'm following not just Rose's story, but the Rosenberg family to tell the story of looted art and some others. And so MoMA Archives has the Rosenberg archive.
Daughter or granddaughter who has a gallery in New York?
Yes, there's a gallery. Yeah, one daughter's a gallerist, and then a cousin is Anne Sinclair here in France. And then there's many smaller archives in France, so I'm going to be going down to Grenoble tomorrow to the Musée de la Résistance that has papers from the association and her family.
So the association started also to gather material.
They've gathered their own material, so I've been through all of their boxes, and then now new materials have been have surfaced. So I'm going to see if there's anything there. So it's a very painstaking and precise process, which satisfies my perfectionism and OCD. So I really enjoy this because it's also a detective process. You see a word, for example, in one archive, in one letter, and the archive tells you, we don't have anything about this person, but you go through it and you see a word, and then you say, there's something like a thread to pull. Maybe I should go to this other place, find more records around this, and then you start to put together something that maybe just a sentence in your book, but is fascinating, and maybe someone has not connected those dots before in this way. And then interviewing some people, it's a little different when that person is not alive, and most of the people who knew her are also not alive. But I may be interviewing someone who knew her Wednesday, so that's pretty exciting.
Is the association supportive?
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
I know
I've been
they're-
very lucky with them. A woman named Jacqueline who runs the association, has become really the caretaker and gatekeeper of Rose Valland's legacy. And we get along very well, and so I'm seeing her as well on Wednesday. And so that has been a great resource, and she's connected me to many, many people to speak to in France, which has been helpful.
There are a couple of art historians who work more broadly, I guess, on
Yes.
this
Right.
topic, one of whom has written about Rose Valland
Exactly.
in French.
So Jacqueline introduced me to
Including
Emmanuel
children's
Pollack.
books. Right.
So she is the head of restitution at the Louvre currently, with a very important job of assessing the Louvre collection if there's anything potentially suspicious in the provenance. And then she's written many books about the art market in Paris during the war, about Rose Valland, about, yeah.
Does this connect in some way? I know this isn't really your topic, but because restitution, for other reasons, having to do with colonialism or
Yeah.
other wars, is becoming, again, such an important topic, and the French are
Right.
returning
Right.
materials.
I think that's one of the reasons that...
Is there a connection?
Yeah,
Or is
no,
there
there is. I
relevance?
mean, so Rose had kind of predicted that this world would come about. She had said that most of the art is going to appear 50 plus years from now. And according to European law, something is yours in most countries. Something becomes yours after 30 years. If you can say that you got it in good faith, and that's a very loose and low bar, because you can say my friend gave it to me, so I don't know how I got it, and then that's good faith. So many artworks appeared in Switzerland in 1976. So if you look at things going for sale now in Christie's and Sotheby's, if you start to look at the provenance, you will see Switzerland, 1978. And then now I think there's been a second wave of things appearing, but the museums and the auction houses now have much more stringent rules on how they have to research provenance, because there's no legal framework for this, really. An auction house actually does not have to disclose any provenance to you if they don't really want to. They have to do it now out of pressure about this subject. And so I think she'd be pleased where we are.
Do you think, though, that it has also an effect or an impact on other forms of restitution? Has anybody
Yes.
spoken to you about that? Or
No, but I do see that the topic comes up a lot, and it's, of course, either about the bend-in bronzes and the kind of colonial restitution, or it's about World War II. And fortunately for World War II art, when I say no framework legally, there is an agreement called the Washington Principles that was created in 1999, and this lays out non-binding agreement for countries that signed it about restitution. So that was really one of the first international movements, and Christie's and Sotheby's tried to follow those principles. Actually, an article I wrote, it was a Van Gogh was going on auction at Christie's a year and a half ago, and it's a watercolor of the haystacks, one of the haystacks, so famous piece. And I read the New York Times piece, and it listed the provenance as it was given by Christie's, and then its last known location in 1945 was Schloss Kogel, which is ERR headquarters, and then it said 1978 or such, Switzerland. And I was like, hold on, like if you work in this world, then you know that's a red flag. And so I called up an editor at Hyperallergic, and I said, you need to let me look into this. And so that was the basis of that article. And so that will come up a lot, and you have to probe those questions. And I went to Christie's, and I said, you need to tell me. But legally, they told me that doesn't really matter what happened between 1945 and 1978, because it's past the 30 years.
Right.
So from their perspective, it doesn't affect their provenance research. But of course, from a historian perspective,
Except they know, yes.
Yeah. They just won't get sued for it, right?
Right.
So it's okay. It's perfectly okay to put on the market.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So Rose is leading you places in the contemporary
Absolutely.
art market
Yeah.
also.
Yeah. So I've written some pieces about restitution in present day.
Yeah, that's another area that could really expand from the book to
and-
lead you elsewhere.
Right. And one of the things that I've written about more recently is about Ukraine and what will happen. So about the protecting of the artwork, and then what will happen later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
again, so much experience that leads people to ask questions about after, before
Right.
the before has even happened.
Yeah.
Before
yeah.
the wars have even happened, or while they're in process. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about, if you're not, we're okay still. Are we within our?
Yeah, we're great.
I should look for a Severine on that account, but we're okay. We'll turn it over. Maybe just ask you
Last
one
question, yeah.
question about narrative nonfiction.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so like I mentioned, narrative nonfiction is nonfiction but exciting, right? So it's not a biography that will go from birth to death. Other people are writing that about Rose Valland, I think, and I think that's great. I'm looking at 1939 to 44, maybe 45. So it's a determined time period, and really going deep into what happened in any of those moments that I'm going to write about. So it's a challenge in itself, but I enjoy that, and kind of hoping that you're going to find something, the Holy Grail. Inevitably, you actually do find it, usually just by digging hard enough. So fingers crossed.
Yes, and things that seem small end up often being the Holy Grail.
But I would say that I approach it almost first academically, in terms of how to go through the archive, and then how I think about the material and the facts and the content, and then I switch my brain into a creative side to figure out how to express it in a way to make you feel that you are there, that you understand these characters, and even if they are characters that are pretty evil, I try to help the reader understand how they may have gotten there. And so sometimes you get into a kind of very, not dark, just deep into someone's psyche, and when you're in the psyche of a Nazi, it's very, very interesting times.
You said also that, this is an extra last question, sorry, Andrew. You said that we talked about being architects, planners, and how your sensibility about space plays into that kind of writing.
Right.
Also.
So for me, the work I did in New York was about going to places and discovering things that you might not notice unless you kind of took a deeper look. And so for me, writing always starts with, where did this take place first? So I'm the kind of person that needs to know, okay, you told me it's 4 rooms in the Louvre on the ground floor, but where are those 4 rooms? So I will go and try to with photographs and asking people that might have an idea. But I realize that actually not all people write in this way. Sometimes it's they need to interview somebody, and that's where their jumping off point is. But for me, it's spatial. So I've been going to all the places so that. And it's also playing to your expertise, I know how to write about space and architecture, so that's where I start.
Well, I'd like to thank you as well. Our discussion today and the prior one have been fascinating. I think that I would answer your question about how you know when you have a good enough story for a book by saying that there are, at least 50 other kind of fallout topics that I think could come out of this work. So.
Yeah, I found some really fascinating things that my agent does like. There's one that he really likes. I'm excited to head down that path after this.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to the Global Center for hosting, and to the Alumni Club of France and Columbia GSAPP.